Film Club.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Film Club. I'm one of your hosts, Andy Harrison, and with me, as always, it is Andy Donaldson.
Hello.
Every week in Film Club, we invite you along to watch film with us, and this week we're taking a look at King Kong.
Tells the story of a film director looking to cast a film abroad, goes and finds a woman on the street and says, "You are my female lead." Goes to an island, he discovers King Kong, and a lot of people die to dinosaurs and other means, and then they manage to suppress him and take him back to New York, where he climbs a tower.
Last week, we took a look at the original Godzilla, Gojira. Very, very influenced by King Kong, but Godzilla would come, about 20 years later? This is 1933 for the original King Kong. And it's one of those films that is steeped in spectacle. It's one of those films that is steeped in very, at the time, progressive effects technology. And one that, for me, I sort of appreciate what King Kong did, I think, a bit more than I actually enjoy watching the film. When you look at sort of their use of stop motion and rear projection and double exposure and the way in which they bring those monsters to life, even the sort of daring nature of it, 1933, trying to tell a story about this like huge gorilla and not just leaving it at like, how do we do the gorilla? Oh my God, that must have been so time consuming trying to figure that out. But not just like finishing it there, but also like throwing in a Diplodocus and then also throwing in like a huge fight with the T-Rex. Obviously wanted to be like really iconic, and all the other sort of effects of not just rear projection, but also the timing of it and how things work together. It's a film where I sort of sit and I look at it and like in lots of ways I find myself marveling at the impressive feat on screen. And then the story itself, I don't know whether it's due to frequent exposure to it, having seen it a couple times over, having seen it being iterated on for the last however many decades, almost 90 years at this point. I find it a little tiresome.
I really dislike this film, Andy. I really dislike this. I would go as far to say I'd rather watch The Grinch than watch this.
That's big talk around these parts.
I know, yeah, it's Film Club talk. That like it hasn't aged well. I didn't find King Kong or any of the dinosaurs menacing at all.
Are you telling me you didn't find his overly active eyebrows menacing?
No, it's well, yeah. The one thing I did thought was pretty cool was when he was smelling and you could see the nostrils moving back and forth. I thought it was a nice bit of attention to detail.
For those who aren't exactly acclimatized to this, while King Kong isn't the first example of stop motion in cinema, like you'd already had stuff like The Lost World in the decade prior. I think the Lost World is like mid 1920s. So although we'd already had that sort of use of rear projection as well, the thing that took King Kong to such a level, to such a degree that, we're still talking about it 90 years later, the reason it resonated with everybody is the scale of it, really. The first, 20 minutes of this film is sort of set up. It's him in New York. It's him going around and kidnapping a girl off the streets, which is just a really weird scene to watch today. The film, by the way, is very sort of steep in lots of misogyny and lots of really quite ugly racial undertones for the time.
That was one of my main issues with the film, to be fair.
Yeah,
the way it portrays women, the writing of her character was terrible.
Watching it now, it's very offensive, and I don't think the filmmakers necessarily meant that sort of offense at the time.
I will harp on one bit with the writing and this particular, the bloke that eventually saves her. He's like, "Oh, women are annoying." Then the next scene is like, "Well, say I think I love you," and it's just like, what?
The film has no interest in character development at all. It really doesn't.
Not at all.
The opening conversations of the film are pure exposition. There's absolutely no character dialogue going on. It's nothing but people sprouting their intentions.
Makes me sore. I go out and sweat blood to make a swell picture, and then the critics and the exhibitors all say, if this picture had love interest, it would gross twice as much. All right. The public wants a girl, and this time I'm going to give them what they want.
I don't know where you're going to get her.
I've got to get her, Weston. We've got to leave here on the morning tide. We've got to be gone by daylight.
Why?
Well, there's a good reason.
People didn't know how to write dialogue back then. There are some examples of it being done well, but it would take many, many decades for that to become widespread and for sort of the industry to learn off of each other. King Kong is not about that. King Kong is a spectacle film. Essentially, King Kong is one of the films that birthed today's modern blockbuster. The idea of going to see a Marvel film, or the idea of going to see the latest Disney film, or the idea of going to see the latest James Bond film, all that stuff has its roots in King Kong, because King Kong was one of those films that showed everybody that not only could you do the occasional scene of big, boisterous spectacle, but what King Kong does that's quite impressive, again, remember this is 1933, once King Kong turns up on screen, he's in the film. Like, he is in that film for the rest of it. They don't just have that one scene where they sort of painstakingly animate King Kong. They bring him into the film, and then that's it. We have that iconic T-Rex fight. We have the stuff where he's like knocking people off of logs. We have the stuff where he's like picking her up and interacting with her and putting her down. We not only have like the rear projection going on, but we actually have double exposure to make sure that like we have live action behind rear projected elements that then have a foreground element. Like, that's really complex stuff to go on. And then they do lots of like really impressive timing. I love the scene, for example, where the Stegosaurus is charging towards him and the guy's like chuck a grenade. And obviously as he chucks the grenade, like, it's so perfectly timed for when the actual grenade goes off in the background, because like that's a separate element. So yeah, not only do they manage to do that for like one scene, but they sustain it for the rest of the, I guess it's probably about a remaining hour at that point for the film. That hour doesn't necessarily tell any sort of interesting story, and I find that it really drags, and I find that there's not a lot to grasp onto once you've sort of got over the spectacle of it. But it's one of those things where I think at the time people were really blown away by it.
I can understand when you're in a cinema and you're seeing this massive creature and you might not be used to it, and it is quite overwhelming. One of the things that was quite overwhelming was the sound. It was a bit all over. It was a bit too much. You had people screaming. Like, I'm so sick at the end by people screaming. Kong's roar.
Fair rare.
Well, the thing is, I said this, nothing against her, but she's just terribly written. She was constantly screaming. I was thinking it'd be nice to, there's more talking. You can see that in later iterations to King Kong where, anyway, we're moving back to that, that what we were talking about before. The sound was a bit overbearing in the sense that there was just noise with added noise with a bit of score. I say a bit of score, there's a lot of score. And it was just a bit too much. But with regard to the score itself, it was superb. It was really, really well done. It was everything behind it. As these spectacles you see, or this spectacle of King Kong that you're seeing, you're having it oomphed by this incredible score accompanying it. It was done by a guy who later ended up doing it Casablanca and Gone with the Wind. It was a guy called Max Steiner. So, he's a tried and tested composer.
So nice getting an overture of that at the beginning as well. Normally, for King Kong, when told today, the character of Anne tends to be written as somebody who empathizes with King Kong. Especially in that him. Peter Jackson version. We tend to have like a moment where she sees him as a gentle giant, or we tend to have sort of when he's taken back to New York, she tends to sympathize with him being taken out of the jungle. She tends to be the one sort of shouting at people, sort of saying like, he's not meant to be here. Like, especially when it gets gunned down at the end. Sorry, spoilers if you haven't seen a film that's 90 years old. Especially when it gets gunned down. Especially when he gets gunned down at the end, she tends to be quite sympathetic towards the whole thing. I found it kind of interesting here that Fay Wray's version, she doesn't care at all. She's just terrified by this giant gorilla. I guess it pays a bit of credit to the idea that this version of King Kong, or the original intention of King Kong, isn't necessarily to be one of the creature features it would like sort of go on to be, but it's actually just to be a straight out horror.
She played in quite a lot. She played quite a lot of horror movies, didn't she? She was in quite a lot of horror.
Yeah, well, she's one of the originators. It's funny you were talking there about like her screaming throughout the whole thing, because it's all she does. Like, it drove Natalie up the wall when we were watching this, the fact that she just keeps screaming and screaming all the time. But she became known as one of the original scream queens, which is a phrase used to describe the idea of a damsel in distress who is just at the mercy of a horror character normally, and just shrieks all the time because there's nothing else for a character to do.
It was an interesting watch, Andy. I will say this. if it wasn't for Film Club, I would have turned it off.
Would you not have even been tempted to watch just for the moment where King Kong is randomly looking around New York and just grabs some poor, just out of the blue woman from her bed, looks at her for a second, and just drops her hundreds of stories?
It was like that guy in the bottom is just like, "Who are you? Yeah, I'm just going to bite you." Honestly, Andy, like, if it wasn't for Film Club, I would have turned it off. And I know that's harsh, but I did not enjoy it.
Would you not even watch it for the moment where King Kong picks up a man, puts him in his mouth, has a bit of a chomp for a second before taking him back out and throwing him away?
At people, by the way. It was at people as well. It was like, have some dead body.
Would you not even watch it for the moment where just a bunch of mannequins get thrown into a pit, one after another, as King Kong shakes a log?
Well, it was interesting because with that log scene, obviously I've seen Peter Jackson's a lot more recent, and there's a really weird moment at the bottom of the valley. They're in the log, and I was thinking, do you get these other strange creatures other than the dinosaurs and King Kong come up? But they didn't. I think that was just Peter Jackson, just being Peter Jackson.
No, well, when he's hiding, you get the skull crawler that pops up, and King Kong sort of
is that like
swats it
lizard
away.
thing? Yeah,
and then there's funny enough that we mentioned that because before Peter Jackson made his version of King Kong, he actually recreated a lost scene from the film. When they fall down that pit,
really?
There's a scene where they were falling into a spider's nest.
Yeah, see, that I was not looking forward to that.
Yeah, I didn't think you'd like that. But yeah, he's meant to fall into this spider's nest, and there's this whole scene where like these giant spiders attack them, and that scene's unfortunately been like lost to time. The effects animator for this, by the way, is a guy called Willis O'Brien. Now, he was sort of very fond of that scene. Now, credit to him for the whole film because the actual stop motion animation is very impressive for the time. Like you can see it's sort of laying the ground for what would come later with stuff like Aardman's work and all that sort of stuff. And who's the guy who did Jason and the Argonauts?
Oh God, no! Yeah, that's it though. Like, look at the stop motion. That with the skeletons, great example. Like all influence from Kong.
Yeah, so like really cool stuff there. But yeah, anyway, sorry. He was very fond of this scene, and somehow it got lost. But when Peter Jackson came around, he didn't just remake that scene, he remade it in the style of that film. So you can technically go and take Peter Jackson's scene and you can cut it back into King Kong, and it's relatively convincing. Funny enough, I think these guys, Willis O'Brien, I actually think did a better job at producing those effects than Peter Jackson did like 78 years later.
That is good. That is a bold statement.
But yeah, one that I do think is better appreciated than it is enjoyed. It's a film so fundamentally of its era, but it's also a film that would go on to shape what cinema would become, and there's appreciation for that.
If you care enough about it, watch it. But if you're on the fence, make your mind up from this review.
So there is King Kong. You can let us know in the comments below what you thought of King Kong, or you can hit us up on Twitter, as always. But Andy and I are going to be back once again next week, where we're going to take a look at Swiss Army Man. So until then, get watching.
Cheers, guys. I'll see Godzilla for life as well.